This evening, for our meditation, I have the great pleasure of inviting Yangtang Rinpoche to lead the meditation. So, he's been dead for a couple of years. So all you have to do is just enter that space of luminous, still, spacious consciousness and let him speak to you. And I will use my voice also. Christoph also. And between the two of us, I think we can invite Yangtang Rinpoche to come and give pith instructions for an experience of accessing and resting in pristine awareness. And these instructions are so clear, so simple, so direct. It's in the language of somebody who lived in our time, was an extraordinary master. And so I hope that you will enjoy and benefit from these words. So simply find a comfortable position. You will find these in your handout, but you can consult those later. No need to look at a page now. You can just do this as a guided meditation. If you wish to look into the mirror of the actual nature of your mind, do not look outward. Rather, look inward. Looking outward involves the delusion of reification. By looking inward, you observe your own mind. Do not follow after past thoughts. Or anticipate thoughts to come. As soon as you encounter the agitated thoughts of the present, by directing your mind inwards, loosely rest right there, without modifying them in the slightest. This natural settling of thoughts is a way of resting, but is not the main practice. However, in that very way of resting, you are ready to encounter pristine awareness, which is the main practice. As soon as you rest in your natural state, thoughts spontaneously cease and depart. Right where the luster of thoughts disappears is the empty, transparent nature of the mind. Without focusing on anything, free of falling to any extreme, a space-like experience arises. Its empty nature is the Dharmakaya. In the essential nature of that emptiness is the transparently luminous, manifest nature of the mind, devoid of any expressible, substantial characteristics. Its spacious and unimpeded self-illumination, which is naturally clear, is the Sambhogakaya. There is no other perceiver of this luminous, empty, pristine awareness. That which is perceived is the empty Dharmakaya. That which perceives is luminous, primordial consciousness. These two may be expressed as emptiness and luminosity, and they may be called absolute space and primordial consciousness. These two are not separate. The manifest nature of that emptiness is luminosity. And the essential nature of that luminosity is emptiness. So luminosity and emptiness are unitary. They are not separate, for they are of one taste. There is no duality of the perceived and the perceiver. This is perceived non-dually. So it is called discerning self-awareness, in which the mind sees itself. That very nature of the one taste of luminosity and emptiness is the equal taste of the good and bad, of samsara and nirvana. So there is no difference between the two, samsara and nirvana. Just that is the great perfection. In the mind stream of one who realizes this great perfection, impartial compassion and impartial pure vision emerge effortlessly and naturally. That all-pervasive compassion is the Nirmanakaya. The pristine awareness of the three kayas is just that. So recognize that it is nothing other than that. As long as there is vague uncertainty, realization of the nature of existence will never come. So you must ascertain this from within. This is the view of the great perfection. And now that Yangtang Rinpoche has pointed out the view of the great perfection to you, there is nothing other to do but rest in that view of the great perfection. So rest in that view without modifying appearances, without striving, with no activity for the remainder of this session. Well, I'm very happy that we have been able to maintain the schedule that I outlined for the retreat, because it was very ambitious, and I knew it would be, but I didn't know whether we would be able to stick to the schedule. And because we have been able to, we will be able to do the most important thing tomorrow. And that is to have a full day of retreat where you go within without directing the mind outward to words that I'm saying, to conceptualizing thought. But as Yangtang Rinpoche said, the real important way of identifying pristine awareness is to first of all look at appearances to your own mind and then see their nature. And so in a longer retreat, what I like to do is to give a full day of individual, what I call solo practice, after introducing each new major topic. So this would be in the spirit of Tibetan practice, where you would get a brief teaching on the view of the Great Perfection, and then you would be sent off to your cave to wear out cushions. And then when some realization had come to you of the topic in which you had acquired the view by way of meditation, then you would know that you were ready for the next step. So that takes years, of course, in that approach. And in a longer retreat, it's helpful, I think, to give at least one day to try to, for an individual to try to integrate the instruction into their own practice and into their own worldview, because that is the way that transformation happens. And so tomorrow we will begin again at 6:30 with morning prayers and have 3 sessions, or 2 sessions, silent sessions after that, before breakfast. And then we will just follow essentially the same schedule throughout the day, a block beginning at 9:30, but there won't be any teaching tomorrow. There will just be meditation. So from 9:30 until lunch will be an opportunity for 5 gatikas. And of course you have the opportunity to make the choice about how to practice during those gatikas. You can do it here in any of the 4 positions, or 3 positions in this room. You can do walking meditation outside. You can meditate in your room. You can meditate outside. You can do yoga. You can do whatever it is that serves your meditation best. Can you hear okay through the headphones? Are you able to hear okay? Yeah? Ah. And so you have an opportunity to integrate the practice, to make it your own, in any of the ways that you choose. And so think of this really as the climax and the highlight of the entire retreat. Because what I am hoping for all of you is that if you are drawn to these practices, if you're intrigued by them, not to replace what you are already doing, or that it's better than what you're already doing or whatever, but this is a different path, it's a different approach. And if you're drawn to this approach of the great perfection, then my hope is that you will have achieved confidence when you leave here in 2 days, confidence in the belief that you know the practices well enough to do them on your own, and then perhaps seek out more teachings, etc., and continue to follow the path. But the 1 day of silent solo practice can give you the confidence that you know how to go about organizing your own retreat. And so if you happen to have 3 days or 5 days, 7 days, 10 days or longer, you could really just, you know what to do. You have all of the practices that you need, and in using just this basic format, it is just one way of many different ways that you could organize a day of retreat. But this way is easy to get a large amount of practice in, of high quality practice, and to enjoy the practice, because you're always staying fresh and clear throughout the day, because you always have the choice of whether you want to do another session or continue meditating without even taking a break between sessions. And as the masters of Mahamudra and Dzogchen said, the key to Shamata is short, frequent sessions. And so short in our use in this retreat is 24 minutes. But when you're doing your own retreat, you can do shorter than that if you like, or you can do longer than that if you like. So you determine the length of your meditation, and this is the key, by quitting while you still want to meditate. So don't let the meditation, the length of time, be some conceptual abstraction that if I'm a real meditator, I must meditate for 1 hour or 2 hours. Goenka does 2 hours, you know. And so if I'm a real meditator, I meditate longer. Well, that's not true. A real meditator is able to maintain stability and vividness for whatever length of time that they are meditating. And so prefer quality over quantity. And so the key is to quit while you still want to meditate. And Ernest Hemingway said something like this also. He's honorary Parisian, right? Ernest Hemingway is an honorary Parisian. And so Ernest Hemingway was a great, model for me anyway, as for better or for worse. As a young writer and a young man. And he said something very much like this advice of the Mahamudra masters and Dzogchen masters. He said to quit writing while there's still water in the well, so that you don't fatigue yourself, and you're ready to go back, you're hungry to go back to meditation when the break is over. So let that be your guide. And then please maintain silence throughout the day tomorrow. This is going to be very important for you to get the most out of your 1 day of solo retreat. And so don't start letting the silence erode, because the quality of your meditation is going to start eroding with it. You're going to really be you can say 20 words to a person, and you will be engaging the conceptual mind, just hearing echoes of that for the next 2 sessions. So maintain silence then right up until 5:30. And then at 5:30 your commitment to silence ends, and then we can enjoy conversation over dinner. And then we will have a wrap-up session at 7 o'clock again. So I think that's everything to say about tomorrow. And are there any questions for tonight?
8 short questions and a booklet.
Okay, let's save the booklet for last.
I think that in the Zen tradition, the rebirth are not presented as something essential. Zen is nevertheless genuine Buddhist tradition.
Well, of course, Zen is a genuine Buddhist tradition, and it is authentic. It is very powerful influence in many cultures, and so it is. If rebirth is not, I don't know Zen, and so I really can't comment about their view on rebirth. But my advice stands nonetheless, too, that it's very important. Certainly in this lineage of Dzogchen and the tradition of Padmasambhava, Bardo practice is just part of the whole cycle of practice. And rebirth isn't, in this tradition, speculation. This is just the experience of people who have achieved full-time lucidity and been able to maintain lucidity of awareness all the way through the process of dying, and then all the way through the process of rebirth. And so they're simply describing their experience. So it's not a matter of just reasoning or analysis. This is just, again, the report of great masters who have had the experience and are telling us what they have experienced. So that's why I say that it's very important, and I know personally for me, it's very important. And the change in my practice, well, I have to go back a long time, because actually my very first introduction to Buddhism when I was 18 years old was Bardo practice of Padmasambhava. So I haven't moved much, even though I took a lot of detours. Here I am, back where I started.
So you have said that the emotions are contagious.
Yes.
Contagious. Does science accept that? Could you please tell us more about that?
I had planned to tell you more about that tomorrow night in our wrap-up session. and we still have 7 questions left. But I will say this in answer to the question. Not only does science accept this, this is the origin of that idea, and it is contagious emotions. Actually, is a term that Daniel Goleman uses, and he actually describes this in one of his more recent books, published in about the last 4 years. And I can't remember the title exactly. But I encountered this when I was doing extra research for my presentations of this union of Paul Ekman's Science of Emotion and Alan Wallace's Practices of Meditation, that is the program of Cultivating Emotional Balance. And so Daniel Goleman has been writing, was one of the very first researchers of meditation, trained as a psychologist at Harvard University, and then has participated in many of the Mind Life conferences that are sponsored or hosted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama ever since 1986. And he has been writing, he's the one who really launched the whole movement of emotional intelligence with his book in, I believe it was 1997. And so I read most of his books on emotion that he produced since then, and then I discovered this new publication where he was describing, so this is actually the latest research on emotions, is that they are contagious. And the way that they are contagious, and this is basically, I'll try to find the title of the book so that we can include it in the reading list for tomorrow or before it's sent out to you. And I know that I have it on my Kindle, so it won't be difficult to find. But the science of this is that the whole role and purpose of emotion in evolution is to communicate with a social group. And this was before the development of language even. We were able to communicate with others. For instance, fear. That's really important. If I'm experiencing fear, it's very important for the entire group to know that, so that everybody can be on alert. A predator has come. And then emotions are not only useful for that kind of communication, and it happens, and this is probably why the communication of emotions and the experience of emotions in our brains happens faster than cognitive processing. Cognitive processing is very, very slow in comparison to the speed of processing of emotions. And this is also what gets us into trouble, because, and what Paul Ekman calls an affect program, affect meaning emotion, an emotional program, basically just like a computer program, instructions are encoded basically in the emotional experience that are started basically that create all kinds of physiological responses and all kinds of mental responses. But all of these are happening before we have a chance even to think about what it is that we're observing. All of these things are starting automatically. And so we automatically begin to get angry, or we automatically become fearful. We automatically become contemptuous or sad. He has 7 basic, call them clusters of emotion, that are universal. And he says this proves that they are evolutionary artifacts, basically emotions. So at the time that Paul Ekman began his research, there was a big debate. So this was long ago in the 1960s. There was a great debate about whether emotions were socially learned, and this was the position of anthropologists, or whether they had an evolutionary, hereditary life. And so Ekman did some ingenious research in a place that had never contacted the West, in Papua New Guinea, and then was able to discover that there are at least 7 basic emotions that are universal among all humans, even those who have never communicated with any outside culture. So communication is the basis and the whole reason for the existence of emotions. And so we are all very attuned. Our brains and our minds are very attuned to the emotions of others. This was what evolution intended. And so we are able to perceive nonverbal cues and maybe things like pheromones, also, things like that. All kinds of biological cues about the emotions that another person is experiencing. And most of what we perceive of the emotional life of someone else is going to come non-verbally. And always, if the non-verbal cues of what we perceive someone is experiencing emotionally and what they tell us they are perceiving emotionally, if they are in conflict, we're going to believe the nonverbal cues because we believe those to be more true. And we know that people can not even be aware of their own emotions or that they can purposely lie about their emotions. So we have evolved to be very sensitive to other people's emotions. And then the way that emotions are contagious is that I perceive an emotion in you, and let's just say it is sadness. And the perception of sadness in you, as I perceive it, actually creates the experience of sadness in me. It stimulates sadness. And this actually is the scientific understanding of empathy. And so the way that I can empathize with you and know what you're feeling is not simply by intuition or simply looking at you and inferring what you're feeling. I know it because what you're experiencing causes the same emotion in me. And then this is part of the very invigorating and exhilarating discussion between Paul Ekman and His Holiness the Dalai Lama that went on for some 55 hours, I believe it was, over the course of just a week or something like that. So can you imagine who in the world gets 55 hours of the Dalai Lama's time in a single week? It's the very rare experience, right? So His Holiness the Dalai Lama thinks this is of paramount importance, emotions. And on the occasion of his 81st birthday, someone asked him, if you were granted one wish on your birthday, what would it be? And His Holiness replied, for everyone to be happy. And key to that, he continued, is for people to understand the nature of their own emotional lives. And so he and Ekman have been working very closely on this emotions for a long time, since 2002, the Mind Life Conference on Destructive Emotions. And so in this very exhilarating conversation over the course of a week, between the two of these great minds, which is captured in the book Emotional Awareness. They talk about compassion and how compassion is a 3-step process. And so the first step is to attend to. So this is what both of them agreed, and Ekman was introducing His Holiness to this large body of research about this, that if we first of all don't attend to, with stable, focused attention, to someone who is suffering, compassion is impossible. And so the two of them talk about the situation in our contemporary world where people are so busy that in our busy lives in a busy city, in a crowded city, we simply aren't paying attention to each other. We keep our eyes focused on the pavement in front of us and keep walking. And so we aren't looking at other people as we would if we were in a small tribal or small agricultural village where we know everyone. So, first of all, attend to. The second is to feel with. So this is empathy. So as I am attending to someone, I see what they're experiencing, and then I feel with them. I feel the same emotion that they're feeling in their body. And then the third step is to act for. So you attend to, feel with, and then act for. And His Holiness and Paul Ekman, well, Paul Ekman is, at this point, just listening to the expert on compassion. Avalokiteshvara is telling him about compassion. And so His Holiness says that it's the third step that is compassion. So, and both of them are in a long section of the book. Both of them are very clear that compassion is not an emotion. And so this is very important to know, because many of us, I think, can feel very critical of ourselves as we are trying to develop bodhicitta and thinking, I don't feel the emotion of compassion. Emotion is a lot more suitable for loving kindness, but compassion is action. It is an aspiration, but it is mostly an action. So what it is, compassion, training in compassion, is preparing yourself through all of the various practices, but Dzogchen practice where you see the boundary between self and other as being illusory. And of course, this is the all of emptiness practice really leads you to the same conclusion, that the boundary between self and other is illusory. And so why should I attend only to my own needs and be ready to relieve my own suffering or to try to supply my own happiness? But wherever you see suffering, there's no difference between that suffering and my own suffering. As Shantideva said, there is only suffering. And so if we accept that, if we really are prepared with that mental framework, then as soon as I attend to and feel with, I naturally act for. Because there's no boundary, no filter between acting for that person and acting for myself. And so that is how compassion, so that is compassion. And then compassion itself can be contagious. And in the same way that other emotions are contagious, scientific research shows that when people see other people act compassionately, they themselves are more prepared to act compassionately. So this is the very important role that we must play, especially in these times, of being role models of compassion in our societies, in our communities, wherever we are able to influence other people. We have an ability to be the start of the virus, compassion. You know how viruses spread so quickly now in social media? Why couldn't it be compassion also? You know, people see it, they instinctively know the value of it, one of the elements also about that is discussed in this book, in the discussions between His Holiness and Paul Ekman, is that compassion feels good. So there is almost a universal experience in humans, not only in bodhisattvas, but in humans in general. When they act compassionately, there is a reward of feeling good. And so Paul Ekman describes this as selfish compassion, but it still works and it's still beneficial. And so there are, even among people who are not practicing great compassion and have this lofty aspiration to eliminate suffering in the world, there are two selfish reasons for being compassionate. The first is that it feels good. And if you were to think back, now just as a thought experiment, on the last year, and think back on what was it that gave you in the last year the greatest pleasure. So was it a day of powder skiing at Mont Blanc? Surfing on Maui? Scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef? You know? Scuba, you know, underwater. In Australia. You know, all of the things that we think are life's greatest pleasures, or the best day of sex, maybe, or a great meal at a Michelin 4-star, or is it 5-star restaurant in Paris? Is that what comes to mind? Or was it a simple act of your own kindness, in which you just felt an inner glow of happiness, your own happiness, for having helped someone? And it may have been a very simple action, but the glow lasts. It feels there's this genuine happiness that comes from that. And so when you look back over the last year, all of those temporary pleasures, you know, they seem really powerful for a day or a week or so when you're remembering them. But when you look back over the whole course of a whole year, all of those pleasures just kind of blend into one. You know, it's kind of a color blue or something. You know, it's all blue pleasure of the last year. And then there are these spikes that really stand out among all of those of perhaps something that you did for someone. So that the first way of being selfishly compassionate is just recognizing that you feel good. And if you are unhappy, one of my teachers said, as soon as you feel depressed about something, as soon as you're feeling blue, a mood, blue mood, unhappy, the first thing to do is to go into service. Just take your mind off yourself and go into service to help other people. And it is such simple, powerful advice because you are instantly going to feel better. And the second way then, so that's still the first way that you could be selfishly compassionate. And the second way is because of empathy. When you are feeling empathy, someone is feeling sad, and you're feeling sad because of their sadness, I think this is a mother's response. She naturally wants to relieve the sadness of her child because it makes her feel sad. And so in relieving the other's sadness, I'm relieving my own. So it's a selfish way of making myself feel better, but the only way to do it is to act for someone else. And so Paul Ekman says there are these two ways of doing compassion selfishly. And then, of course, there are ways, in the Buddhist training that you transcend that selfishness and you just eliminate the boundary between self and other. And so you're just eliminating suffering as if it were your own, because there's only suffering. Not my suffering or your suffering. There's only suffering. And so training then is preparing yourself to act whenever you see suffering. And so it is a matter of training, because normally we see suffering and we look the other way. Or that's their suffering, this is not my problem. This is France. I'm an American. What do I know about French suffering? On and on like that. We have many excuses to just look the other way. I'm too busy. I have to get to work. So this was the training then to prepare yourself to act instinctively whenever you see suffering was really beautifully captured in this slogan of Mary MacKillop. Mary MacKillop, who is the only Australian saint. So she was canonized in the Catholic Church as a saint, the only one from Australia. But she was at her nunnery, and where she had a home for orphans is where I did my 5-week training on cultivating emotional balance, a 5-week residential training. And there were like stations of the cross, and all of these had sayings of Mary MacKillop. And the one that I remember that really relates to what we're talking about is this one. Never see an unmet need. Unmet. So a need that has not been addressed. So never see an unmet need without doing something about it. And if that just becomes your mantra, then you are just continually prepared to act whenever you see a need anywhere around you. And so, yes, emotions are contagious, and it is based in science. Emotions are contagious, and it's based in science.
I haven't understood the instructions on meditation of this afternoon and the difference with the meditation of yesterday. I forgot what to tell you. Et de ce matin, ok. D'hier et de ce matin, pouvez-vous répéter? So I haven't understood the instruction on meditation for this afternoon and the difference with the meditations of yesterday and this morning Could you please re-explain?
Yes. So there's very little difference. And that really is the point. So we have been using 4 points of Wangchuk Dorje as just a template for our Vipassana practice. And just using these 4 points to organize our Vipassana. So the first of these is all appearances are mind. Then mind is empty. Emptiness is spontaneous actualization. And then spontaneous actualization is self-liberating. So those 4 points, and we are resting in simultaneous stillness and motion as our Shamata practice, right? So we are resting, watching with still awareness, appearances arise. So far, this is only a Shamata practice. And then we simply we simply notice, we observe that all of these appearances, because I am resting in still awareness, global, spacious, open and receptive, but boundless. This space is boundless. And as I am resting in this boundless space of awareness, the movement of appearances arise within that space. So it becomes very clear to me, all appearances are mind, and that they are not an appearance of something that exists inherently, externally, independent of my perception. Because what I am experiencing exists only in my mind. It doesn't mean that there's nothing out there in the physical world, but what I am experiencing is a mental appearance. And then mind is empty. We did the Vipassana practice on that with the citations from everyone from the Buddha to Nagarjuna, and Dzogchen masters. And then the emptiness is spontaneous actualization. Emptiness is not a sheer vacuity or a sheer absence, but it is this absolute space of phenomena which is fizzing with energy. And then all of these appearances that arise from this as spontaneous actualizations self-release. So yesterday we did that as a Vipassana practice that is the integration of Shamata and Vipassana. So we do the same Shamata practice. We're resting in simultaneous stillness and motion, but now we integrate Vipassana practice by just recognizing these 4 points or just asking these questions, basically. What about the mind that is perceiving this empty appearance? Okay, all appearances are mind, but what about the mind? Is that inherently existent? We can just ask that question while these appearances are arising. And then, can I find the mind? Can I find an inherently existent mind in any of the bases of designation of these appearances? So on and on like that as Vipassana practice. And then today, we use that same practice, basically, these 4 points of Wangchuk Dorje, pointing out the Dharmakaya, are, in my opinion anyway, and I am studying this text now, and will be spending the entire winter really immersed in this text, since I just received a transmission on this text from Khandro Rinpoche. And so, my opinion anyway, is that these 4 points are not only very useful for Vipassana, for cutting through to pristine awareness, but then this is also the view from pristine awareness. So this really is exactly what Yangtang Rinpoche was describing also. You know, the non-dual nature of luminosity and emptiness, really. So that's what really the meditation is really the same. But now when we are resting in non-meditation, which was really the point of this afternoon's meditation, we cut through to pristine awareness. For instance, I'll just point out one thing in these instructions from Yangtang Rinpoche. And these are such pith instructions of a master that every word really counts. So he said it in the very early stages, you're resting, watching appearances come and go. And then he said, and these appearances are really just expressions of the luminous nature of the mind. And then he said, so as these appearances arise, abide, and dissolve, follow the appearance as it dissolves. So right where the luminosity dissolves, just follow the appearance where it dissolves. And he said, there is the empty nature of the mind. So the luminosity leads you to the empty nature of the mind. And then he says that empty nature is Dharmakaya. But I just wanted to point that out. So you can use this as a very powerful element also in your shamatha practice as you're watching appearances arise, abide, and dissolve. Really stay in continuous engagement with them right to the instant they dissolve, and let that lead you right into the empty nature of the mind. Because often between the between the dissolving of one appearance and the arising of another appearance over here, there is a gap between. And that gap is the empty nature of the mind, the space of the mind from which appearances arise and into which they dissolve. And as you continue in your shamatha practice, that gap between the dissolving of one appearance and the arising of the next can become longer and longer and longer. And then you're simply take that gap, the empty nature of the mind, as your object of mindfulness at that point. Because remember, with this taking aspects of the mind as the path, the object of mindfulness is the space of the mind and the appearances that arise within that space. So that gap, even when there are no appearances arising, you still have something to be mindfully engaged with, and that is the gap, the space, the empty nature of the mind, Dharmakaya. So the luminosity of the mind, if you follow that right to the point where appearances disappear, leads you to that gap, Dharmakaya. So today then, the meditation was essentially the same, but now the view was from pristine awareness. So the point really is to realize that the same 4 points and really the same meditation leads you right from shamatha through the fusion of, or the integration of shamatha and vipassana that leads to cutting through to pristine awareness, and then really is the model for the experience of resting in pristine awareness. And then when you are resting in pristine awareness, once you have cut through to pristine awareness, then you are practicing non-meditation. And non-meditation is no striving, no desiring, no activity, and no modifying any of these appearances. So you're just resting there in the luminous nature of and the luminous flow of these appearances. So really, the person who observed this is exactly right. The practice is more or less the same, but it is now, today, this afternoon, it is resting in pristine awareness and non-meditation.
are two parts here, two questions. First, even if the mental appearances and the eye don't have any form or color, etc., they even so they manifest. Can we really say that that something which manifests doesn't exist?
Ah. No, we definitely would not say that. So something that manifests does exist. And so the point of origin, location, destination, and examining shape and color of the mind itself and also of mental appearances is to recognize simply that these do not have a physical form. And if they did have a physical form, we would know that they come from an origin. We would know where they're present because they would have a location in space. And so we could say they are here. We could give it a GPS coordinate. Or we could say it's inside the skull. So, and when it disappears, it would go to someplace. And if it were physical, then we would know that it has attributes. So shape and color are just really examples of attributes that physical things have. And so really what that analysis is intended to do is simply to recognize that the mind itself is not a physical entity, and thought, mental appearances, are not physical. And as simple-minded as that seems, remember that is exactly the prevailing opinion in contemporary science, cognitive science anyway. So all of the mind science basically believes that thoughts must have shape or color because they're physical. They are the epiphenomenon or the product of physical processes. And so by definition, actually in physics, any epiphenomenon of physical processes must itself be physical. So if the mind is, and consciousness is an epiphenomenon of neurons and electrochemicals, neurotransmitters and all of this, then it must have physical attributes. So the Tibetans actually were doing very sophisticated analysis in saying and asking these very simple questions. And so it's not that I don't exist. I certainly do exist. And the sense of I definitely exists. And mental appearances definitely exist. But how do they exist? That's the question. They do not exist as physical entities, and they do not exist with a nature of their own. So this I that seems to be so solid, so real, so concrete, so unchanging, so uncontrollable, to be the same I as when I was a child to when I am an old man, the same I just experiencing different things as it goes through life, that I doesn't exist. That I is an illusion. So the I does exist, mental appearances do exist, but how do they exist? They exist like every other thing in the world, every other thing in the universe, as a dependently originated phenomenon. They are produced by causes and conditions, and they are temporary crystallizations of space.
Second point. So this is quite similar. Can we say that consciousness doesn't exist because it has characteristics? When we examine it, it is clear, spacious, luminous,
can we say that the mind doesn't exist when a mind is clear, spacious, and luminous? Or consciousness doesn't exist?
That's a similar question. The one
Ah, so if it's the same question, then the same answer. But there could be a slightly different question in what I heard. But that's okay, we'll move on.
Okay, so I misunderstood.
Ce que je voulais dire, c'est que, à l'inverse des phénomènes mentaux qu'on observe sur le sol, l'attention telle qu'on observe, elle reste telle, lumineuse, avec ses caractéristiques. Donc à partir de ce moment-là, ça s'entient, c'est ce qu'on peut dire que ça n'existe pas.
This actually is Alan Wallace is a very powerful debater. And anyway, he took us through a very interesting debate about this question one time. And so the question is then, if pristine awareness is beyond karma, is beyond causes and conditions, as all of everything else is, does this mean that pristine awareness is the one thing, the one exception, that is inherently existent? What do you think? Well, we know the answer. That nothing exists inherently, but how do you get there convincingly to that position? And so intriguingly, so when we talk about the mind now being produced by causes and conditions, so if the mind exists inherently, it must exist with characteristics that we can know. But we can't find those, so there's an absence of that inherently existent mind when we're looking for it. And what we are left with then is a mind that is produced by causes and conditions. That's the one that we know. Emotions, drugs that we take, lack of sleep, all of those things can be causes and conditions influencing the state of my mind. But what is that mind referring to? It's referring to the configured mind, everything downstream from substrate consciousness. So all of the 51 mental factors, everything mentation, everything from klish to manas, I am, on down, becomes configured. So that mind is produced by causes and conditions. But we know that that is not consciousness itself. We know that there is something beyond that that is said to be, well, so I'll just give, because we're running out of time, the end of the debate is that it is not self-existent because it is neither existent nor non-existent. So it is beyond all of the conceptual extremes. And so you can't say even that it exists inherently or as a product of dependent origination. But you can't say that it doesn't exist either. Either of those, any debate that you bring to try to debate pristine awareness just comes back with does not compute. It does not apply. And so the question, again, is a very common question is, when we achieve pristine awareness, is it one awareness, that my awareness enters the big Atman of Hindu philosophy? So, is that so? Or does each Buddha still maintain his own individual mind stream? So the question is it one or is it many? The answer does not compute, because it is beyond, pristine awareness is beyond all of the conceptual extremes. Anything that we can say about it, what we know is that that is not it. Whatever we say about pristine awareness, we know that is not it. Our conceptions cannot describe it. It can only be a finger pointing at the moon. And so that's why you get these authentic pointing out instructions from people like Yangtang Rinpoche, and then just go wear out the cushion. Because your experience is going to be an individual, non-conceptual experience. And so it's a very insightful question. And the only way to answer is, does not compute.
When we meditate, where do we place our tongue? Because, tongue?
Yeah?
Because if I release really, and if I release it really, or relax it, I notice that it is between my lips, my two lips.
Between the lips. I have never seen that or experienced that myself. But how can you argue with the truth of someone's experience? I can't say that that is not your experience. When you relax, your tongue goes between your lips. What you may experience if that happens, I would guess, is the production of saliva. And that you probably are having to swallow saliva quite a lot. So in the 7-point posture of Vairocana, actually, there is a position for the tongue. And that is right up at the front of the palate, above the teeth. And so that the point of that is that it controls the production of saliva. And so you can be really disturbed in your meditation, and sometimes you hear this a lot in people around you, that there's just a lot of saliva produced, and then there is a loud, continual swallowing of it. So that position of the tongue, just slightly curled at the top of the teeth in the front of the palate, really is very, very effective for controlling saliva. And so you can just, it just becomes natural for it to be there with practice, I guess. And you totally forget about it and are totally relaxed. So for me, and I think this is the advice of that has been passed through all traditions, really, of the 7-point posture. So I would recommend trying that.
When I dream, it is like a movie with images and with talk. What is this activity? Is it the mental factor of thought? only, or is it the visual sense? Because we say we see images.
Right. Well, I think, oh. I think it's both. That you have a visual consciousness in that there is sensory impressions, and you see images, you have visual experience in dreams, you can hear sounds, you can taste foods, you can feel pain. All of those things happen in dreams without any sensory input of a sense organ, because those are all shut down. And so this is part of the proof, really, that is used in Padmasambhava's teachings, that all of these appearances are mental appearances, not physical appearances, because we have real appearances arising in dreams when there is no knowing an external reality. And then so we have a visual consciousness, but not the visual organ of the eye, but we have the visual consciousness that it would be operating during a dream. And then mental consciousness would get involved with the visual consciousness just as it does in the waking state, and then conceptualize that visualization and say, it is this, it is that, I like it, I don't like it, etc. So I think it is exactly like in the waking state.
So you talked about long gone memories that could come back up during the practice. Can those memories sometimes come not from this life?
Certainly, yes, in principle. And that is part of achieving shamatha, is that you begin to have access to all of the memories of substrate. And so these memories then, when you achieve the clairvoyant powers and other paranormal powers, extrasensory powers that are achieved with shamatha, like being able to hear conversations around on the other side of the world, and walk through walls, things like that, and clairvoyance, being able to read other people's minds. It's said also that you begin to have memories of past lives. And so some people, I think, and especially children, and there has been Ian Stephenson at the University of Virginia, did long 2 generations now of research on accounts of reincarnation and people with past life memories. And they have demonstrated that there is no other explanation for the memories that these people have. And interestingly, these children especially can often remember bardo experiences also. If they are having memories of a previous incarnation, they also often have memories of the bardo in between. But, so yes, I think that it's very common to have that experience where you have a fragment especially of a memory and you wonder, that doesn't seem to be connected to me, to this life. So, yeah, a past life experience would be among the possibilities of that. And sometimes, but it seems sometimes so contemporary. Like it's set in today's world. A fragment, an image comes up that seems like a memory, but it doesn't seem like my memory. So is it somebody else's memory? More research needs to be done.
I've been wondering if appearances exist in the physical world or only in mind, because mind appearances are the only ones we experience, isn't it?
So is the question that seem to be only mental appearances?
Yes, I've been wondering if appearances exist in the physical world or only in mind.
Okay, well, I can answer that.
That's all that we experience.
Yeah, so appearances do not exist in the physical world. Absolutely. So appearances are only a mental experience. So that doesn't mean that nothing exists in the physical world. But what it is that I am experiencing exists only in my mind. And even the color green seems so simple and it seems so truly to exist in the leaves of the tree, in the grass. The grass is green. The leaves are green. That's what we say. But the green exists not anywhere in nature. It does not exist in the leaves. It does not exist in the light waves. Even though the light waves correlated with the experience of green in my mind are correlated with a certain wavelength of light, but it is not a green wavelength, because the same wavelength will be perceived by a different sense receptor or a different measuring device as something completely different, by a spectrometer or something, a spectrograph. How does that perceive that same wavelength of light? As just wavelengths that are interpreted on a graph or a piece of paper or a computer screen, and we attach the label green to it because it corresponds to my individual experience. But the point is that all of the qualities that we experience in appearances and the appearances themselves exist nowhere in the physical world. They exist only in my own mind as mental appearances. And so where do these come from? The appearances do not come from the physical world. They come only from substrate. If they are appearances arising to the mind of a sentient being, they only come from substrate. And then if you are resting in pristine awareness, then you can say they come from the aware aspect of that ground, which is Dharmadhatu, the absolute space of phenomena.
So it's about the morning prayers. So we began each day with the visualization of Shamata, late born Vajra. And so part one of the question, could you briefly speak about him and about his role in the transmission from the Buddha, the
So briefly, this is something that I very much enjoy doing in longer retreats, actually, is to, first of all, read a section of a book that I wrote, which is in very much a part of this. A leading figure in this book is Padmasambhava, but it's the biography of an American who was the only person in the history of Tibet ever invited to Lhasa. Every other Westerner who ever arrived in Lhasa from the 1200s right up until the 1950s snuck in. They came in disguise. And so this one person, Theos Bernard, is the only person ever in the history of Tibet who was invited. And so because he was invited, he was treated like royalty, given the highest tantric empowerments in the Jokang by the Ganden Tripa, lived with the wealthiest family in Lhasa for 3 months, and then was sent home with 50 mule loads of the finest quality of mules, like horses. But so a lot of the best quality scriptures and artifacts from Tibet with the purpose of introducing Tibetan Buddhism to the West. So anyway, that was the biography. He's very little known, but was a huge celebrity in his time. And then he disappeared without a trace in 1947 in the Himalayas. So it's a very interesting story, but Padmasambhava is a very important figure for him in this story. And so one of the things that I like to do is to read the excerpts from my book about the history of Padmasambhava, the life of Padmasambhava in Tibet. And it all based on the primary source is the biography that Yeshe Tsogyal wrote, called The Lotus Born. And so basically, Padmasambhava is a historical figure. He was prophesied by the Buddha, saying that the Buddha said that he would appear again. There's a particular sutra where the Buddha said that he would appear again as being born on a lotus, etc., etc. Sounds, very much like Padmasambhava. So he was born in the 9th century in the land of Udayana, and which is probably present-day Swat Valley in Pakistan. And so then, of course, he was discovered as an infant, or a young boy actually, by the servant of a childless king, in the middle of a lotus pond floating on a lotus. So that is the lotus born, Padmasambhava. And so then, anyway, many, many miraculous things, extraordinary things in Padmasambhava's life led him to be regarded as one of the greatest of all tantric practitioners of his time. And so King Trisong Dutsen was building the first monastery at Samye in Tibet. And so he invited Shantarakshita from Nalanda, I believe, or Vikramashila, to come to help build this first Buddhist monastery in Tibet to introduce Tibetan Buddhism. But he found that the local spirits were hostile to the introduction of Buddhism, and so they were tearing down the walls of the temple as they were being built, basically. So all of the day's progress of the temple was being torn down by these hostile local spirits at night. And so Shantarakshita realized that bodhicitta alone was not powerful enough to subdue these local spirits. So he had told the king to invite Padmasambhava to come and use wrathful means of Tantra to subdue the local spirits. And so the king invited him, Padmasambhava came, and suffice it to say, he was able to subdue the local spirits and turn them into Dharma protectors. And then Samye was built. Padmasambhava stayed for a period of time, varying opinions about how long that was. A few months to 50 years is basically the range of opinion. But during that time, he had 25 disciples, and among them, these 25 disciples, was the previous incarnation of Dujam Lingpa. So they had this very powerful karmic connection already from this lifetime. And then one of the, if we had more time, sorry to keep saying that, but what I really enjoy doing is in the evenings reading sections of Dujam Lingpa's autobiography. And the autobiography is listed also in the references section on the last page of your handout. It's called A Clear Mirror. And this is some of the most extraordinary account of a life that you are ever going to encounter. I've never read anything like this from any of the extraordinary Tibetan autobiographies or biographies. The story begins, so the story of Dujam Lingpa's life begins with a conversation between Padmasambhava and Yeshe Sogyal. And Padmasambhava is despairing, and he's saying that the great perfection has fallen into such a bad condition in Tibet that we have all of these bad teachers telling people that the great perfection is nothing but just resting with a blank mind. Something like that. And that Padmasambhava then just says, is ready to give up hope on Tibetans and the world. And Yeshe Sogyal says, don't give up hope. There are still people that you have a powerful karmic connection with in Tibet. And if you should instead emanate as one of these individuals and then just teach the great perfection in its pure form. And so this then is exactly then Dujam Lingpa at this time was hanging out in a Pure Land. And then Padmasambhava comes to him in his Pure Land and says, I have a mission for you. I want you to take rebirth and to go teach the great perfection back on this earth. And Dujam Lingpa says, please, ask me anything, but not that. Don't ask me to take rebirth. You know these sentient beings. They can't understand anything. I would be wasting my time. And Padmasambhava says, there are 3,000 people that you have a karmic connection with. And these will become your students. And among them, 1,000 people will achieve, will cut through to pristine awareness. And 13 people will achieve rainbow body. King Trisong Dutsen and his 25 ministers will become your disciples. And so he concludes, your rebirth will not be a waste of time, it will be a great benefit. And then all throughout the biography of Dujam Lingpa, Dakinis are appearing to him, and everyone from Avalokiteshvara, Tara, Nagarjuna, but many of these had prophecies about the barbarians that were massing the barbarians in the borderlands that were massing to invade Tibet, and that Dharma was going to disappear soon in Tibet, and within 100 years or so. And so startling to how accurate that, of course, was, because you had, first of all, the British barbarian hordes on the south in India, and then, of course, you had the Chinese on the eastern border. And it was the British that really got there first, and that in the year that Dujam Lingpa died in 1904, but just created havoc, basically. It was only a simple military incursion of Colonel Younghusband, but it forced the Dalai Lama to go into exile. He was gone for 13 years. In that time, the Panchen Lama took power, created a schism between the Panchen Lama and the Dalai Lama when he returned, and Tibet was just really never the same. It was just the start of a spiral into chaos, all through the 20th century, really. And so, and then the Chinese invading again, beginning during the 13th Dalai Lama, drove the 13th Dalai Lama into exile in India this time. And then, again, things just were, it was just turmoil in Tibet, really the whole 20th century. So there were these prophecies. And so what the mission of Dujam Lingpa was to teach the essence of all the dharmas in the great perfection, and to teach them with such clarity. And this was going to be of benefit for people of the future, especially in cities of the West. And that it was so important to teach this, to go back to Tibet to teach this to these 3,000 disciples, so that Dharma would survive the invasion of the barbarian hordes. So that is the importance of Dujam Lingpa, Padmasambhava, and then the Lake-born Vajra, Yeshe Tsogyal, all of these other great beings just continually appeared to Dujam Lingpa to give him these teachings of the pure Dharma, of the proper, true interpretation of the great perfection, so that he could teach it to his disciples. And so it's said that Dujam Lingpa never had a human teacher. All of the Dharma that we have of him came as visions or mind termas that were planted in his mind when he was a disciple of Padmasambhava, but mostly as these visionary experiences of the Lake-born Vajra. So coming to him and teaching most of these great texts, it was the aspect of Padmasambhava in the form of the Lake-born Vajra. And so that's why it is so powerful to do these particular prayers with this particular mantra, because this is the mantra of the Lake-born Vajra, not the generic Padmasambhava mantra. This is the mantra of the Lake-born Vajra. We visualize the Lake-born Vajra coming to us, and the pristine awareness of the Lake-born Vajra merging with my own pristine awareness. So very powerful preliminary practice to do these particular practices that were given to Dujam Lingpa by the Lake-born Vajra. Something like that. Oh yes.
This visualization is particularly powerful in my case. Is it advised to do it, for instance, at home, at the beginning of the practice, at the beginning of the formal practice, or during any practice, in order to resettle peace, or the peaceful, I don't know how to say, to calm down and to have access to the primordial consciousness.
Yes, and so we'll just make this the last question and answer. So this will be the last answer to the last question. So Yangtang Rinpoche actually advises that to begin every session, you take the 4 empowerments. So you visualize the Lakeborn Vajra in front of you, and you receive those 4 empowerments as the 4 lights, and then you invite him to come to the crown of your head, merge into you, and then you rest in that pristine awareness, and then you just do that practice. You just practice then, having merged your pristine awareness with the pristine awareness of the Lakeborn Vajra. So Yangtang Rinpoche advises in a retreat to begin every session with the 4 empowerments. And then here, he's talking, we're talking about 24-minute sessions now. And Yangtang Rinpoche is talking about longer sessions that you naturally grow into in long retreat. So Yangtang Rinpoche himself was practicing right up until his death, about 20 hours a day. And so he had only a few sessions, and he described this but I can't remember it precisely. But it was basically the first session would be, say, 8 hours, something like that. And then 6 hours and whatever the balance would be to make it, so he might only have 3 or 4 sessions, but they would be long sessions and basically fill the whole day. So at the beginning of each one of those sessions, then a long session, he would advise to begin with the 4 empowerments. So if your sessions in retreat become naturally longer, which they will, 1 or 2 hours, it's not uncommon that in a year of retreat that your session might, or it's not unknown anyway, it's maybe not entirely common, but certainly that your individual sessions could become 5 or 6 hours within a year or so. So you would begin each one of those sessions, but it might be a little too much to start every 24-minute session with the 4 empowerments. Maybe not. You could experiment with it and see whether that's really beneficial to you. But you could also think of each block of gatakas that we're doing. For instance, we have a session before breakfast. We have a session between breakfast and lunch tomorrow. So you could start that session with the 4 empowerments. And then we have a session after lunch before dinner. And so you could easily start that session also with the 4 empowerments. And I think that would be very, very beneficial. So I think we had better call it a night. So it is a great mass of merit that you have created with your dedicated practice today, with your pure motivation. And may this virtue ripen not as some temporary pleasure, but may this ripen as the greatest good for the greatest number of beings. May all beings come to know authentic happiness by finding a genuine path with genuine teachers to guide them on the path. And may all beings follow that path to genuine liberation so that suffering is eliminated from the world. One by one, all beings free, all by the goodness of what you have done today. May it be so.